The woman sat at the grand piano, her back straight but her shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with posture. The piano itself was a thing of beauty, polished beast of black lacquer and white ivory that seemed to glow under the hotel's fancy lights. It was the centerpiece of the lobby, a huge room filled with the smell of expensive perfume and floor wax. This was a temple built for money, and the music she made was its prayer, soft and unobtrusive. She had been here for 3 years, a human decoration. As much a part of the furniture as the velvet sofas and the potted plants. Her name was Alara, but most people just called her the pianist. For 3 years, her world had shrunk to the 88 keys beneath. Her fingers in the sea of faces that never really saw her, her fingers began to move, tracing the familiar, comforting path of a gentle tune. It was a song everyone knew, a simple melody that floated like a feather on the air, never demanding attention. It was perfect for this place. It was the kind of music that filled the silence without ever breaking it. She played it well, of course. There was a precision to her touch, a softness that came from decades of practice. But no one heard the tiny, complicated notes she would sometimes weave into the melody. Little secrets just for herself. They were ghosts of more difficult pieces, echoes of a time when her music was meant to be listened to, not just heard. Now, those little flourishes were her only rebellion. A quiet protest in a world that had asked her to be quiet. A man in a very expensive suit walked past. His phone pressed to his ear. He was talking loudly about numbers and projections, his voice sharp and confident. He didn't glance at her, didn't break his stride. To him, she was just part of the background noise, like the hum of the air conditioning. A group of women, dressed up for a night out, walked by next, laughing and clinking their glasses. One of them paused for a second, her head tilted, as if she almost heard something special in the music. But then her friend said something funny, and the moment was gone. They moved on, their laughter swallowing the last few notes of the song. Alara didn't mind. She was used to it. It was better that way. When people started to listen too closely, they usually wanted to talk to her, and she didn't want to talk. She just wanted to play. She let the last note hang in the air. For a moment before her fingers found the beginning of another song, this one was a little faster, a little more cheerful, but still just as simple. It was a song about romance and moonlight, a story that felt 1,000,000 miles away from this cold, shiny lobby. As she played, she let her mind drift. She thought about the first piano she had ever owned, an old upright that had been in her family's living room. It had been out of tune, and some of the keys were yellowed and stuck, but to her, it had been a treasure. She remembered sitting on that hard bench as a little girl, her feet not even touching the floor, her small hands struggling to reach the chords. She remembered the feeling of discovery, of creating something beautiful out of silence. That feeling had been her best friend for most of her life. Her hands moved automatically, playing the songs they had played 1,000 times before. But her mind was somewhere else. She was on a different stage, in a different lifetime. She could almost feel the weight of a heavy velvet dress, the heat of the stage lights, and the expectant hush of a dark concert hall. That was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty like this silence. It was full, heavy with anticipation. In that silence, she was the most important person in the world. Every person in that room was there just to listen to her. They held their breath for the first note, and when the music was over, the sound of their applause was like a physical thing, a wave that could lift you right out of your seat. Here, the only applause was the distant ding of an elevator arriving. A young couple, clearly tourists, stopped for a moment. The young man had his phone out, taking a picture of the huge chandelier. The young woman smiled at the music, a genuine, kind smile. For a second, Alara felt a flicker of connection. She looked up and their eyes met. The woman gave her a small nod, as if to say, "This is nice." Alara managed a small, tired smile back. But then the young man pulled her arm, pointing towards the reception desk, and the moment was over. They were gone, swallowed by the busy hotel. Alara looked back down at her hands, at the keys that knew her better than any person ever had. She was a ghost in her own life, her talent diluted into something so simple it was almost invisible. She was a painter who had been asked to only paint walls white, a poet told to only write shopping lists. The hours passed in a blur of melodies and memories. Her back started to ache, a familiar dull pain that settled in after hours of sitting in the same position. She shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position, but her fingers never missed a beat. They were her loyal soldiers, doing their duty no matter what. She played on her music a constant, gentle river flowing through a desert of indifference. She thought about her small apartment, a quiet place filled with books and a few old photographs. She thought about the cup of tea she would make when she got home, the simple pleasure of its warmth in her hands. These small thoughts were what got her through the long nights. Finally, she saw the clock on the far wall. It was almost 10. Her shift was almost over. She played the last song of the night, a soft, dreamy piece that always felt like a goodbye. She put a little more of herself into it, a little more of the sadness and the beauty she felt inside. It was her own private farewell to the day, a farewell to this room and all the people who had not seen her. When the last note faded away, she let her hands rest in her lap. The silence rushed back in, louder than ever. She carefully closed the lid over the keys, a final respectful gesture. Then she stood up, her joints stiff and protesting. She packed her worn sheet music into her bag, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked through the lobby, which was now quieter, the crowd thinner. No one looked up. She was just a woman leaving her job, as invisible as she had been when she arrived. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and out into the cool night air. The city was still noisy, but to her, it felt like a profound and roaring silence, a testament to another day of being beautifully, completely, and utterly unheard. The next evening, the lobby of the Grand Azure Hotel felt different. It was as if the air itself had been replaced with something thicker, heavier, charged with a nervous energy. The usual quiet hum of scattered guests was gone, replaced by a rising tide of voices and the sharp, frequent clinking of champagne glasses. The hotel was hosting a gala, a big one. The lights seemed to shine brighter, the marble floors looked more polished, and the potted plants had been fluffed and arranged just so. It was a night for making impressions, for showing off wealth and power. And for Alara, it meant her job, which usually felt like a quiet form of invisibility, now felt like being a spotlight on a stage she never asked for. She watched as the guests began to arrive. The men wore dark, perfectly fitted suits that looked expensive and restrictive. The women were like exotic birds, their dresses in every color of the rainbow, their jewelry catching the light with every movement. They moved in groups, laughing loudly. Their conversations a mix of names she didn't recognize and numbers she couldn't imagine. They were a world away from the tired tourists and business travelers she usually played for. These people were not here to rest. They were here to conquer. And she, at her grand piano, was just another piece of the expensive decor. Meant to add a touch of class to their evening of networking and negotiation, she started her set, choosing the most gentle and inoffensive songs she knew. She played a soft, jazzy tune that was mostly smooth rhythm and easy melody. It was the kind of music that was designed to be ignored, and for the most part, it was. The guests were too busy greeting each other, too busy talking about their latest successes to pay any attention to the quiet woman at the piano. She was fine with that. It was what she was used to. She played on, her fingers moving with a practiced ease. Her mind a safe, quiet place away from the noise and the pressure. Then she saw him, the event manager. He was a man who always seemed to be moving, his body coiled with a tense energy, as if he was afraid that if he stopped for even a second, the entire evening would fall apart. He darted from the entrance to the bar to the reception desk, whispering instructions to staff. Straightening a napkin here, adjusting a light there. He was the conductor of this chaotic orchestra, and his face was a mask of forced smiles and barely concealed panic. He was the one who had hired her, the one who paid her, and the one who saw her not as an artist, but as a background element. Like the lighting or the temperature of the room, she knew he would come over. It was inevitable. On a night like this, every detail had to be controlled, and she was a detail. She saw him finish a quick, sharp conversation with a waiter, and then turn his gaze towards the piano. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and he gave a curt, businesslike nod before beginning his approach. He walked with a purpose, his shoes making no sound on the thick carpet, as if he was a predator stalking its prey. Ilara felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She kept playing, her fingers never faltering, but her focus was no longer on the music. It was on the man getting closer and closer. He arrived at her side, leaning down slightly so he wouldn't have to shout over the noise of the crowd. He smelled of cologne and stress. "Listen," he began, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He didn't use her name. He never did. Big night tonight. Very important people. Investors. He gestured with his chin towards a group of men who were laughing heartily near the grand staircase. "I need you to keep it light. Very light." He paused, looking at her hands on the keys as if assessing them. "Nothing too complex. Nothing that distracts. Just something simple, the usual. Background charm." The word landed in the quiet space of her mind with the force of a dropped stone. Simple. Said it so casually, so easily, as if it was the most natural request in the world. He patted the glossy lid of the piano, a quick, dismissive gesture, like a man patting a loyal dog. "Just keep the mood pleasant. That's all." He gave her another tight smile and turned away, already moving on to the next crisis, the next detail that needed his attention. He was gone in a flash, his presence as fleeting as a shadow. But his words remained, hanging in the air around her. She kept playing, the soft, jazzy melody continuing to flow from her fingers. But something inside her had changed. It wasn't an insult, not really. It was worse. It was an erasure. It was the complete and total dismissal of everything she was, everything she had ever been. All the years of practice, all the hours of sweat and tears poured into mastering her instrument. All the passion and heartache she had poured into her music, all of it had been reduced to one word: simple. Might as well have asked a master painter to only draw stick figures, or a poet to only write one-syllable words. The resentment she had been carrying for 3 years, a quiet, heavy burden she had learned to live with, suddenly began to feel hot and sharp. She thought of all the evenings she had sat here, pouring her soul into the keys, only to be ignored. She thought of the complex, beautiful pieces she could play, the masterpieces that were collecting dust in her memory. She thought of the young girl she used to be, the one who believed that music could change the world, or at least a small part of it. That girl had been buried under layers of pleasant and unobtrusive and simple. Her fingers, which had been moving so smoothly, began to feel stiff. The melody she was playing, once so comfortable, now felt like a lie. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces laughing and talking, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside her. They wanted simple. They wanted background music. They wanted a charming little tune to accompany their evening of self-congratulation. Something inside her shifted. A gear that had been stuck for years finally clicked into place. A quiet, firm resolve settled in her heart. It was as calm and clear as a still, deep lake. She let the current song fade out, the last note hanging in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the noise of the lobby. She rested her hands in her lap, a stillness coming over her. She looked down at the ATA keys, not as a tool for her job, but as a voice. And she decided it was time to speak. For a moment, there was only the noise of the party. The sudden absence of music created a vacuum, and the sounds of the gala rushed in to fill it. The laughter seemed louder, the clinking of glasses more sharp and insistent. It was as if someone had turned up the volume on the world, and the world was a busy, shallow place. The woman sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, or maybe she just imagined it. She didn't look up. She was no longer playing for them. She was drawing a line in the sand. Quiet, obedient pianist was gone, and in her place was something else, something they hadn't asked for but were about to receive. Then her hands moved back to the keys. The first note that came out was not simple. It was a single, clear sound that hung in the air like a question. It was a note full of doubt and a deep, quiet sadness. It was so different from the cheerful, empty tunes she had been playing that it cut through the noise like a knife. A few heads turned, their expressions showing mild annoyance, as if a machine had malfunctioned. But then another note followed, and another, weaving a melody that was complex and haunting. It wasn't just a tune. It was a story beginning to unfold. Her fingers, which for years had been trained to be gentle and pleasing, now moved with a new authority. They pressed into the ivory with a weight that seemed to come from her very soul. The music began to grow, a slow, mournful climb filled with a sense of longing. It was the sound of loneliness, of memories that brought both comfort and pain. A woman who was halfway to the bar stopped, her hand holding her empty glass frozen in midair. She tilted her head, a frown of confusion on her face, as if she recognized an old, forgotten emotion in the melody. The music began to change again. A current of agitation started to flow through it. The notes became faster, more insistent. It was no longer just sad, it was becoming angry. Storm was brewing within the melody, a conflict between despair and a desperate hope. Her left hand began to play a series of dark, rumbling chords that were like thunder in the distance. The sound was so full, so powerful, that it seemed to physically push against the walls of the lobby. The conversations around the room were faltering now. People were turning away from each other, their faces drawn towards the source of this unexpected, powerful sound. The event manager, who was barking orders at a waiter across the room, stopped mid-sentence. His eyes narrowed as he looked towards the piano, his face a mask of confusion, slowly turning to dawning horror. The woman was lost in the music. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. She was no longer in the hotel lobby. She was back in a small practice room, sweating over a difficult passage, feeling the frustration of not being able to get it right. She was on a stage, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was a young woman again, full of dreams that had been slowly worn away by years of playing simple music. All those years of being ignored, of being told to be quiet, to be pleasant, to not be a distraction, it all came pouring out of her. Every note was a word she had never been allowed to say. The piano was her voice, and it was shouting. The piece built to a frenzy. Her fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion, creating a cascade of sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was a musical representation of a battle, a fight for survival. The melody was tossed back and forth between the high and low keys, a desperate, urgent cry. The entire lobby was captivated. A man who had been boasting loudly about a recent business deal now stood with his mouth slightly open, his glass of champagne forgotten in his hand. A group of women, their jewels sparkling, stood in a silent circle, their faces turned towards the piano with expressions of awe. The room, which had been a collection of separate, selfish conversations, had become a single, unified audience. They were no longer guests at a gala, were witnesses to something extraordinary. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The furious energy of the music receded, leaving behind a melody that was fragile, broken, and incredibly beautiful. It was like the calm after a storm, the quiet that comes after a great struggle. Notes were soft, hesitant, filled with a sense of weary acceptance. It was the sound of a heart that had been broken but was still beating. This part of the music was perhaps the most moving of all. It was raw and honest, full of a vulnerability that was impossible to ignore. A few people in the crowd had tears in their eyes. They didn't know the story the music was telling, but they could feel its truth. They could feel the pain, the struggle, and the glimmer of hope. She held this fragile moment for as long as she could, her touch incredibly light, as if she was afraid the melody might shatter. But then, the final heroic section began. It started as a quiet pulse, a steady beat that grew stronger and more determined with each passing second. The melody began to climb again, but this time it wasn't filled with sadness or anger. It was filled with a defiant, triumphant energy. It was the sound of a spirit that refused to be broken. Her hands moved with a power and precision that was breathtaking. The music swelled, filling every corner of the vast lobby, shaking the very foundations of the gilded room. It was a declaration, a final, powerful statement of who she was. The final chords were a massive, crashing wave of sound. They were not just loud, they were overwhelming. They filled the space with a final, explosive burst of emotion, a culmination of everything that had come before. It was the sound of a soul finally set free. And then silence. Her hands came to rest on the keys, the last vibration fading into the air. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, stunned, reverent silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire room was frozen, held captive by the echo of the masterpiece they had just experienced. The air seemed to crackle with an electric energy. The woman sat with her head bowed, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She had poured every ounce of her being into the music, and now she was empty, but it was a good kind of empty. It was the feeling of a long-held breath finally being released. She slowly lifted her head and looked out at the crowd, not as a background musician, but as an artist who had just shared a piece of her soul. And for the first time in 3 years, they were looking right back at her. The final chord of the masterpiece seemed to hang in the air, a solid thing that vibrated not just in the ears but in the chest. It was a sound so full and so complete that it left no room for anything else. The lobby of the Grand Azure Hotel, a place that was never meant to be quiet, was plunged into a silence so deep it felt like a different dimension. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. A man with a phone halfway to his ear to take a picture froze, his thumb hovering over the screen. A waiter carrying a tray of empty glasses stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with wonder. The sea of wealthy guests, who just moments before had been a churning mass of noise and ego, was now a still, captivated audience. They were no longer investors or socialites. They were just people, stripped of their titles and their importance, connected by a shared, powerful emotion they couldn't quite name. The silence was finally broken by a sound that was utterly mundane. A woman, her hand trembling slightly, set her champagne glass down on a nearby table. The small clink of the glass on the marble was like a gunshot in the quiet. It was the signal that the spell was broken. A low murmur began to ripple through the crowd, not of conversation, but of shared disbelief. People turned to each other, their eyes wide, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and a profound sense of having witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. They looked at the woman at the piano not as a piece of furniture, but as a person. For the first time, they saw the lines on her face not as signs of age, but as a map of a life lived. They saw the slight heave of her shoulders, not as a sign of fatigue, but as evidence of the immense effort she had just expended. And then the calm was shattered. The event manager, his face a mask of fury and panic, pushed his way through the stunned crowd. He moved with a jerky, frantic energy, a man whose carefully controlled world had just been violently overturned. He reached the piano, his polished shoes scuffing the floor in his haste. He leaned over her, his voice a low, dangerous hiss that was meant to be a whisper, but was laced with rage. "What was that?" he demanded, his words sharp and pointed. What in the world was that? He wasn't asking a question. He was making an accusation. He looked from the woman's calm face to the hands resting in her lap, as if he couldn't comprehend how those same hands had caused such a beautiful, disruptive chaos. That was not simple jazz. That was not background charm. You disrupted the entire event. You completely ruined the mood. The woman slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, which had been distant and closed during the performance, were now clear and focused. There was no fear in them, no apology. There was only a quiet, steady calm that seemed to infuriate him even more. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. She saw the panic in his eyes, the desperation to regain control. She saw a man who measured success in pleased clients and flawless events. A man who could never understand that some things were more important than a pleasant mood. It was the music that needed to be played, she said softly. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that his angry hiss could not match. It was a simple statement of fact, not an argument. There was no defiance in her tone, only a deep, unshakable conviction. The manager stared at her, speechless for a moment. He had expected excuses, apologies, fear. He had not expected this quiet, unassailable truth. Needed to be played? He sputtered, his voice rising slightly. A few guests nearby turned to look. Do you have any idea who these people are? This is a gala for investors. They don't need This. He gestured wildly at the piano, as if it were a wild animal that had just been let loose. You're done. Do you hear me? You're finished here. Pack your things and get out. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't plead or bargain. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of submission, but of acceptance. She had known this would be the consequence. In fact, it was the only consequence that mattered. To be asked to leave after playing that music was not a punishment. It was a validation. It meant that the music had mattered. It meant that it had been heard. With a slow, deliberate grace, she began to gather her sheet music. The pages were slightly wrinkled, the edges worn from years of use. She handled them with a gentle reverence, stacking them neatly. The sound of the paper rustling was the only sound between them. The manager stood over her, fuming, his powerlessness growing with every calm, measured movement she made. He had fired her, but she was the one who was in control. She was the one who was leaving on her own terms. Her head held high. She placed the stack of music into her worn bag and pulled the zipper closed. The sound was a final, decisive click. Then she stood up from the piano bench, her movements slow and dignified. She ran her hand lightly over the smooth, cool surface of the piano, a silent goodbye to an old friend. She turned to walk away, and as she did, the crowd of guests seemed to part for her, creating a path to the door. They watched her in silence, their faces filled with a respect that had been absent just minutes before. They were no longer seeing a background pianist. They were seeing the artist who had just given them a gift they would never forget. She walked through the lobby, her steps echoing softly on the marble floor. She didn't look at anyone, and no one tried to stop her. The event manager watched her go, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage. He had one, in a way. He had restored order to his gala. But as he looked at the faces of his guests, he knew he had lost something far more important. The magic was gone. The room was just a room again, and the people were just people, already starting to forget the powerful emotion that had just united them. The woman pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The city was alive with its own music, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a passing bus, the murmur of voices on the street. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh, free air. The weight she had carried for 3 years, the heavy cloak of invisibility, was gone. In its place was a lightness, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a very long time. She didn't know what she would do tomorrow. She didn't have a job and the money was tight. But for the first time in a long time, she felt rich. She had played a masterpiece, and in doing so, she had finally found herself again. She walked away from the hotel, not looking back. A solitary figure disappearing into the vast sleeping city, her heart echoing with the beautiful, defiant music she had set free. The first light of morning crept through the thin curtains of her small apartment, painting stripes of pale gold on the worn wooden floor. The woman was already awake, sitting at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea cradled in her hands. The silence in her apartment was different from the silence of the hotel lobby. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a peaceful one, filled with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of a sparrow outside her window. Not slept much, but it wasn't the restless, anxious sleep she was used to. It was a light, dreamless sleep, the sleep of a person who had finally laid down a heavy burden. She had no job. She had no income, and yet she had not felt this free in years. The memory of the music, the feeling of her fingers flying across, the keys, the stunned silence of the crowd, it was all still with her, a warm, glowing ember in her chest. Her phone, usually a silent, forgotten object on her kitchen counter, began to buzz. It was an old, slightly battered model, and the buzz was harsh and insistent. She ignored it at first, thinking it was a wrong number, but then it started again and again. A few moments later, it buzzed with a text message. Annoyed, she finally picked it up. The message was from an old friend she hadn't spoken to in ages. It was short and simple. "Are you okay? I just saw the video." The woman frowned, a knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. "What video?" She typed back a quick question, her thumbs tapping clumsily on the small screen. Her friend's reply came almost instantly, a link to a popular video sharing website. With a sense of growing dread, she clicked on the link. The video loaded, a shaky, vertical recording that was clearly filmed on a phone. The image was blurry at first, focusing on the backs of people's heads, and the glint of champagne glasses and the ornate ceiling of the Grand Azure Hotel. Then the camera panned down and zoomed in on her, sitting at the piano. The audio was tinny and distorted, but the music was unmistakable. It was her, was the masterpiece. She watched, her heart pounding in her chest, as the video captured the last 3 minutes of her performance. She saw the fierce concentration on her own face, the way her body swayed with the music. The final crashing chords and the stunned, reverent silence that followed. The video ended just as the event manager began his furious approach. She stared at the screen, her mind reeling. Someone had recorded it. Someone had posted it. She scrolled down to the comments section, her hands trembling slightly. There were thousands of them, and more were appearing every second. "Who is this woman?" one read. "I was at that gala." The music stopped everyone in their tracks. It was magical. Another said, "This isn't just a pianist. This is a storyteller." I cried. And another, "The most beautiful act of defiance I have ever seen. They asked for simple, and she gave them her soul." The comments were a wave of emotion, a tidal wave of appreciation and wonder that was completely overwhelming. She, the invisible woman, the human decoration, was being seen, and not just seen, but heard. Truly heard. Her phone began to buzz again, this time with an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A cheerful, fast-talking voice on the other. Ian asked if she was the viral piano lady and wanted to know if she'd be interested in appearing on a morning TV show. She politely declined and hung up, her head spinning. Another call came in, this time from a radio station, then another. Her phone, once a symbol of her quiet, isolated life, was now a portal to a world she didn't recognize. She turned it off and set it down, needing a moment to breathe. She walked to her window and looked out at the bustling city street below. Everything looked the same. The cars, the buildings, the people hurrying to their jobs, but for her, everything had changed. The next few days were a blur. She stayed in her apartment trying to process what was happening. She saw herself on the news. A small segment on a local channel about the mysterious hotel pianist who had taken the internet by storm. They even sent a reporter to the hotel, but the event manager, looking stiff and uncomfortable, simply said they had no comment and that the pianist was no longer in their employ. The story, he had clearly decided, was a PR problem to be managed, not a moment of beauty to be celebrated. She felt a pang of pity for him, for his inability to see beyond the surface of things. She was tempted to just let it all blow over, to hide in her quiet apartment until the world moved on to the next viral sensation. But a part of her, the part that had played the masterpiece that night, knew that she couldn't go back. The door had been opened, and she couldn't close it again. She had spent years being quiet, being simple, being invisible. Now, the world was asking her to speak. And then, another call came. This one was different. The man on the other end was not a reporter or a TV producer. He was the director of a small, independent concert hall on the other side of the city. He spoke softly with a voice full of respect. He told her he had seen the video, and that he was moved not just by the performance but by the courage of it. He didn't talk about view counts or viral fame. He talked about the phrasing, the dynamics, the emotional depth of her playing. He knew the name of the piece she had played, and he spoke about it with the knowledge of a fellow musician. "We don't have a big budget," he said, his voice sincere, "and we can't offer you fame, but we can offer you a stage. We can offer you a real piano and an audience that has come for one reason only, to listen. We would be honored if you would consider performing a recital for us." The woman felt a tear roll down her cheek. It was the first offer that had nothing to do with her being a novelty or a sensation. It was an offer based on her art, on the one thing she had left that was truly her own. She accepted, her voice quiet but firm. A few weeks later, she stood backstage at the small concert hall. It was nothing like the Grand Azure Hotel. The air smelled of old wood and dust, not expensive perfume. The walls were not marble, but brick, and the lighting was soft and warm. Through a crack in the curtain, she could see the audience. There were no tuxedos or sparkling gowns, just ordinary people sitting in quiet velvet seats, their faces turned towards the stage with an expression of open, hopeful anticipation. They were not here to be seen. They were here to see. They were not here to network. They were here to listen. A stagehand gave her a small nod, signaling that it was time. She walked out onto the stage, the single spotlight following her. Audience applauded, a warm, genuine sound that was not polite or obligatory, but full of welcome. She walked to the center of the stage, where a beautiful, well-loved grand piano sat waiting. She sat down on the bench, its smooth wood, familiar and comforting, under her fingers. She looked out at the sea of faces, all looking back at her. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen. She took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. She was no longer a ghost in a gilded cage. She was an artist, and she was finally home.